Order. Good morning. I call this meeting of the Public Accounts Committee to order. Today we have with us the Auditor General's Office presenting their April 2016 report, which is a follow-up on recommendations from their 2012 and 2013 reports. We will begin with introductions, starting with Mr. Wilson.
Gordon Wilson, MLA. Claire Digby.
Good morning. Suzanne Lonis-Croft, MLA, Lunenburg.
Gilbert Strong, Halifax, Shabakto.
Ian Rankin, Timberley Prospect.
Good morning. My name is Tim Houston. I'm the MLA for Pictou East.
Good morning. Dave Wilson, MLA for Sackville-Cobequid.
Good morning. Lenore Zan, Truro, Bible Hill, Millbrook, Salmon River. Thank you.
And I'm Alan McMaster, your chair, MLA for Inverness. I would ask members to ensure their mics are at an appropriate level for when they're speaking, just so we make sure we pick up everyone's questions and comments. We'll start with you, Mr. Pickup. Please allow you to introduce yourself and your colleagues, if they could introduce themselves, and then begin with your opening comments.
Sure. Michael Pickup, Auditor General of Nova Scotia.
Terry Spicer, Deputy Auditor General.
Evangeline Coleman, SAD Assistant Auditor General.
Good morning, and I would like to thank the Public Accounts Committee firstly for their interest in the follow-up work that we do. In this case, we've looked at 23 audits from calendar years 2012 and 2013. I would note that this is our first time doing a standalone separate report on the follow-up work that we do, based on partially on the encouragement of the Public Accounts Committee and their interest in this work. So I want to thank them very much for that as well. I would also like to take this time to thank the person on my left and the person on my right for leading this work, and the many people back in our office who really put a lot of effort into moving this report forward by such a substantial time, and also by having it as a standalone report. It definitely took the work of a team, and the team did a fabulous job in doing so. So I would like to certainly thank them. Now to the report. The overall result, as you know, is 60% implementation rate of the approximately 400 recommendations from the 23 audits. That leaves 40% of recommendations not yet in the complete status. Recognizing that some organizations hold more of the recommendations not completed, it is also important to point out that while an organization may have a higher percentage completion, they can still have recommendations that are critical and that need to be implemented as well. I would also like to note, because I think it's important, to recognize that 6 organizations did implement greater than 80% of the recommendations. So as an example, the Department of Justice would fall into that category. So that tells us that this can be done, and it is a reasonable expectation. I look forward to the Public Accounts Committee holding these organizations accountable for their results and for what they're going to do going forward to act upon these recommendations. Recognizing that the overwhelming majority of these recommendations continue to be accepted for implementation by the organizations. And I think that's important. For the most part, 93% of these recommendations were not in disagreement about the importance of them. So therefore, I think the Public Accounts Committee needs to hear from these organizations to say, then, if you agree with them, why aren't they getting done more quickly? And what risks continue as a result of this not getting done? So that is it for opening comments. Be pleased to take questions now from members.
Thank you, Mr. Pickup. We will start with Mr. Houston for 20 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Pickup, for the introductory comments. So we're looking at the results from 23 audits that were conducted, I guess, 3 and 4 years ago, and we're looking back to see what's been done. We know what people said would be done, is that the vast majority of the recommendations were accepted, and probably a little bit of head nodding, and we'll get to that. And now here we are, years later, looking back, and 60% implementation rate. Seems low to me, but how do you feel about it?
So overall, I want to be clear that a 40% not complete recommendation rate is not satisfactory. These things need to get done, and where they continue to be accepted for the large part, let's see some focus on these, and let's see these get done on a more quickly basis.
Okay, so not impressed.
So I would say overall not satisfactory results, and I would hope that the government would do better.
Okay, I certainly share that hope. When you look at the range of recommendations, I'm sure there's some that probably even when they were discovered at the time of the audit, and the fact that they've not been implemented now, there's probably some that really surprised you. Like, was there some that you kind of shake your head and say, I can't believe they don't do that? Is that kind of, would you say that covers a certain range of the recommendations?
I would say that given there's 161 recommendations that are not complete, there are some significant program and service areas that we're talking about here. So if we're talking about prescription monitoring or occupational health and safety, these are significant areas where some recommendations have not yet been complete. So I think it's more about being disappointed on what has not been yet acted upon versus other types of feelings on this.
Is there any acceptable reasons? Is there any reason that you would find acceptable that say that after 3 years a recommendation hasn't been acted upon? Is there, presumably there'd be some discussion on some of these, and maybe the department said something that you kind of went, well, yeah, okay, I can see why that, but or is it just the case that it's just not, there's just no good reason why they're not why they haven't been implemented?
So two answers to that question. The overwhelming majority of these things, I would say it's not reasonable that they're not yet acted upon. In some cases, we have indicated in the report that it's a little more reasonable. And the example I would give is the Health Authority. So they've decided to take recommendations on capital planning that were directed towards a predecessor health authority and say, we want to apply that everywhere. We're going to say not complete. That's pretty reasonable.
Okay.
So overall, in most of these cases, not reasonable, but there are pockets where it's reasonable, and we will say it's reasonable.
How do we change the culture of government such that maybe more importance is placed on actually implementing these recommendations?
So firstly, I would say that my overwhelming discussion with the people who run government is that these recommendations continue to be important and continue to be accepted. What I would look for is to accountability for people who are running these organizations. So if you're looking at the Health Authority, if you're looking at the IWK, as examples, these organizations have board of directors in place. They have presidents or CEOs who are ultimately responsible for oversight, and I believe implementation of these recommendations and oversight of those are a part of that as well.
So at the moment, each kind of department is accountable for their own implementation rate. So I guess the minister would ultimately be responsible for each department. Is that kind of how it works at the moment?
Right, so if you take a case like transportation, for example, and the mechanical branch audit that we did with a very low implementation rate, it would be the Minister of Transportation who would ultimately be responsible for the rate of implementation of his department's recommendations.
So in your role, do you have a chance to speak to the ministers about what's being implemented and what's not? Have you spoke to any of the ministers of these departments?
So for this report, and I'm clicking through my memory here as we go. So for this report, I did not meet with any ministers, keeping in mind that big bucket of the 133 recommendations not complete. Those are the ones organizations themselves said are not complete. So the point of having a lot of discussion around that is not quite as relevant for us at the time. I think it's a great question, and we bring this forward to you as a tool, to talk to these organizations to say, why isn't this done?
Okay, so if it doesn't seem to be working, I guess the system's not really working, and historically, I think a 60% implementation rate and obviously a 40% of non-implementation, that historically that's probably kind of where it's been, right? So I wouldn't say that that's a system that's working that effectively. Do you have any recommendations for this committee as to what we should be, like if having a minister responsible is not kind of cutting it? Is there, in other jurisdictions, do they have somebody higher? Like, is there somebody who oversees these, maybe in the Premier's office, or any guidance you can give us how we can bring more, I'm going to use the word respect, how we can bring more respect to the recommendations you make to the departments?
Since you're asking, one suggestion I might make off the top of my head is that the government has an internal audit committee that oversees and monitors progress on these recommendations. What you may want to consider doing is halfway through the year, bring the chair of that audit committee in to say, give us a status report where we are today. We cut off in October of 15, but if you bring them in, say, with the April deadline to say, okay, where are we now? So for example, if you had a status report as of April 16, they should be able to update these, keeping in mind it's not going to be audited. The other thing the committee may want to consider is talking with the audit committee and chair about if you do want a little bit of assurance over an interim report, the government has an internal audit shop, and perhaps they could work with the audit committee of government to provide you some sort of ongoing or regular reporting.
That's an excellent suggestion. Thank you very much. Before I get into some of the specific recommendations, I am curious. I know we've had some discussion in the past about ranking recommendations, and I've heard the points that maybe it's not the Auditor General's office responsibility to kind of give weight to, but I wonder if, as opposed to ranking, there might be an opportunity to categorize. So don't rank one recommendation against another as one's more important than another, but to categorize them as like must have, kind of critical or should be done, and in terms of what the risk is. Is that done in other jurisdictions, or is that something you've contemplated here, like kind of making them green, red, yellow, or?
So the first thing I would say is that we do 8 to 10 performance audits a year, and we pick areas which we think are higher risk, are critical to be done. So we do believe we're picking key areas for audit. So therefore, the recommendations that come out of that should be all important. And I think the danger of us ranking them is what would happen, for example, if we didn't rank that prescription monitoring program as a high risk? What would happen if we said that was lower risk? And then something happened and it would be up to us to explain, when it's really not up to us to explain the ranking of these things. We think they're all important. If I look to the controls audits over the health information systems at Health Authority and IWK, what if something happened because one of those controls were not implemented? Then you sort of run the danger of saying, well, why did you? I like to stick to all of these are important. Now, I think to give you a tangible example of something we are doing, starting with the audits that we did in the fall of 14, we are focusing the recommendations, and over the next couple of years, you'll probably see the number of recommendations that we're actually making will be approximately half of what they are now. So that will help the Public Accounts Committee focus, help the departments focus as well.
Okay, well, I appreciate that. Just in terms of procedures, so this is a report that looks at how the departments did on implementing recommendations from audits that were done in 2012, 2013. I think last year there was a kind of a similar report that looked at recommendations from 2011, 2012, so there's a 2-year cycle. So does that mean that next year, another year will fall off? So like this year, we're no longer looking at the implementation rate from audits done in 2011. Next year, we'll no longer be looking at the implementation rate of 2012. So is there a risk there that, given your audit cycle, that stuff just doesn't get done, and maybe government realizes if we can kind of weather this out for a couple of years, it'll fall away? So I'm just wondering that may have an impact on what gets implemented and what doesn't, and it really should not have that impact.
Couple of thoughts there. I would really hope that would not impact an organization's timeliness on implementing these things. And I think all the more important is that things get implemented in a timely basis. And I think the indication that the organizations continue to agree is important. The other thing I would note is that we audit plan and pick our 8 to 10 performance audits, a year on a regular basis. We update our audits. Some of the discussions we have internally are what has happened to our past audits. So for example, if you look at the Health Authority and IWK, just because 2012 is disappearing next year, we're going to keep an eye to say, okay, what are we hearing on these audits? Are these things being addressed? If we get a sense and we think it's important internally in terms of the ranking versus what we can do with our resources, we may come back and re-audit something like this because we feel it's important. So yes, on your first part, things will drop off, but I think we continue to monitor risky areas to say maybe we need to come back.
Thank you. And to your point earlier about the internal audit committee, and I think there probably is a role in something like that for the internal audit committee and making sure that these things get implemented. I'm just trying to remember. I think at some point this committee wrote to the chair of the internal audit committee asking that they provide some assistance to other departments and supervise their implementation of recommendations. I might be misremembering, but do you recall?
There was some correspondence, but I think maybe what you want to do is talk to the chair of the audit committee again to see what is being done, because I run the risk of sort of not giving you the most up-to-date process in terms of what's happening.
My recollection is they kind of said no, they're not interested in helping with that, but maybe.
I'm going by memory, but I'm not sure it was something as concrete as an interim report, because presumably government, and that's part of what we make in the chapter, government is monitoring these things all of the time, right? Like this is something that should be done on a quarterly basis at least.
Sure. Yeah, so there's definitely a role there. So, okay, there's some good ways forward from that, so I appreciate that. In terms of the failure to implement recommendations, and these recommendations are made to address risk areas, whether it's safeguarding of assets, whether it's protecting Nova Scotians, or there's always something behind the recommendations. And in terms of the failure to act on these recommendations, I think we have seen, unfortunately, some very concrete outcomes, negative outcomes from that. And I'm thinking of, obviously, of the prescription drug monitoring system. So if those recommendations that your office had made around prescription drug monitoring had been implemented a couple years ago, it's possible that we wouldn't have seen at least the recent case that we see in the news of the abuse of the system. I guess it's hard to say, but I'm sure that it would have reduced risk in the system. Is that fair?
So two responses to that. Firstly, I don't want to comment on the particulars of that case. I don't think that would be appropriate, but probably more importantly, we were pretty clear in that report that while these recommendations are not implemented, the risk of abuse and misuse continues. So it was the conclusion in that report was fairly clear. You know, I went back and read it again the other day. You know, front page of that report indicates that.
Yeah, the risk was real. Now, since over the last month or so, has the department come to you and said, well, let's talk about these recommendations again?
Ms. Coleman-Sad?
Do you mean specifically the prescription monitoring
Yes.
program?
Yeah.
No, the department has not reached out to us. And generally speaking, I would say, you know, we wouldn't get a lot of requests after the fact. If my memory is right, I don't think we typically would get a lot of requests on any of the audits afterwards to talk about them. I think we have a fairly robust process to clear the reports to start with. Departments usually have a pretty good understanding of the recommendations at that point.
Because I think at the time the minister was on the news saying he was going to look into this whole prescription drug monitoring system and do a type of review. You must have been thinking to yourself, I know a good place for you to start, the recommendations of our report, but it's interesting that nobody reached out to you, I guess. Would that be an opportunity for you to write to them and say, just remind the department of the recommendations that have been made?
Mr. Pickup?
So the departments know we do this follow-up work, so, I mean, this happens every year, so they expect that. Keeping in mind that we as well are trying to be efficient, so we're following up 400 recommendations. When departments or organizations put the response in that bucket of not complete, it's not complete. So there's really, you know, we really move on from there. Where the risk is the ones that departments indicate are complete or where we disagree.
Mm-hmm. But across these 133 recommendations of 400 that the departments have said, yes, we agree that's something we should do, but yet over the time period of years, they kind of haven't gotten around to doing it. There'll be a wide range of risks, and we know of one situation where the risk came to fruition. But it would be, I'm sure it would be impossible to kind of quantify even the financial risk of some of the other ones. But I hope that situation brings a sense of urgency to getting around to these recommendations. I can't assess whether that certain sense of urgency is actually happening or not. My sense is maybe it's not, if even in the face of that, the Department of Health didn't reach out to your office to say, let's talk about these again. That hasn't happened, so I don't want to infer from that there's no sense of urgency. But do you feel a sense of urgency coming to get these in, or is it kind of business as usual of no, we didn't get to that yet?
I think in answering that, I would focus on why we do this report and why we do this work. So the idea for us is we're telling Nova Scotians where things stand, but we're also using this really as a tool for the Public Accounts Committee to hold government to account. So for those organizations where they're not complete and they agree they're not complete, it's really a chance for the committee to speak to these entities and say to them, you know, why isn't this done? How urgent is this for you? What are the limitations? What are the risks that continue? So it's really, we're doing this in many ways as a tool for you and to help you fulfill that role of accountability.
Okay.
Mr. Houston, you have about 1 minute remaining.
1 minute, okay. there is a recommendation here that's not going to be done, and it is with the addiction services, that the province should have a single province-wide intake and wait list, and that seems like a pretty solid recommendation, that the province should have that, but should have a province-wide intake and wait listing, but it's not going to be done. Can you shed any light on why something like that wouldn't be done?
Ms. Coleman-Sad?
So, as Mr. Pickup said, when recommendations are not completed or when they're not going to be implemented, there really isn't a whole lot of work for us to do on them. We focus our work on the recommendations that they've said are complete to determine whether they really are complete. So, for an answer on that, I would suggest that you talk to the department about why they don't intend to implement it.
Order. The time has expired. We'll move to the NDP Caucus and Mr. Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for being here, and thank you for kind of pulling out the follow-up and recommendations. I do think it's useful, and it really gives, I think, a heightened importance of the recommendations and implementation of them compared to the way we did it in the past, where recommendations and follow-ups were kind of at the tail end of an audit that you've done. Not to dismiss how important those audits are. Ultimately, with the recommendations, who in government is ultimately responsible? Is it the department heads, the ministers, the premier? I mean, ultimately, when you do an audit, you make recommendations, who's ultimately responsible to ensure they follow up and implement the recommendations out of your reports?
Mr. Pickup.
So accountability and responsibility for the recommendations, including the ones that are not complete, in my mind very much rests with the nature of the organization. So for example, if you have the IWK and the Health Authority, those organizations have a president and CEO, depending on which one, who report to a board of directors. So the oversight, of course, is very much at the board of directors, recognizing they are also responsible to the minister as well. But certainly, I would look to the boards of those organizations and to determine what their role is in overseeing how well their organizations are doing on these audits. If you take an organization like transportation, who is on the list of not implementing many recommendations, of course you would speak to the deputy minister in a forum like this, but ultimately, in the case of transport, he reports to the Minister of Transportation, who would have to answer as to why these things aren't done. So a lot of the answering on this, I think, recognizes the complication or the way our system is, right, and who has accountability for these recommendations.
Great, thank you. And one of the reasons I asked that, I mean, ultimately, and I would agree with the organizations. You're looking at the IWK and maybe some of the arm's length organizations that provide the services. But ultimately, I mean, as you said, the deputy minister, the minister need to play a role in ensuring these organizations are following through. Would you agree with that?
Mr. Pickup.
I would agree.
Okay. Knowing from my past experiences, you know, in Communities, Culture and Heritage, Department of Health, often, I don't believe I've ever met with staff from your office on the recommendations. Do you tend to, and I think you answered this just a minute ago, do you tend to target the senior managers, or I would say the deputy ministers within the department? Is that who you mostly work with when you do the audit, but also doing follow-up and getting the response from the department after an audit is done?
So I will start with an answer to the follow-up part. So in this case, for example, I have no trouble sharing with you that I would have met with the president of the IWK. I met with one of the VPs of the Nova Scotia Health Authority. The CEO was going to be there, but she got called away to talk about the results on the follow-up. And I also met with the Deputy Minister of Transportation. So you can see I sort of target. It's difficult to get out and see every single person, but I'm trying to target the ones that frankly aren't doing as well. I would have met with the Deputy Minister of Business as well, and the Deputy Minister of Education. So areas where we have disagreement, because business and education we have a disagreement with, and areas where the implementation rates have not been as good, I would have met with them. To go to the second part of your question, on a particular audit, we're always available to meet with a minister, and the deputies know that, but in some cases we ask to meet with ministers. An example I would give you is, I've shared with the House before, on the oversight audit on education last fall. We would have met with the Minister of Education to talk to her about our concerns from that audit as well.
Thank you for that. Just one area I didn't hear you was the Deputy Minister of Health. With a lot of concerns around prescription monitoring program and knowing that there is a financial component to addressing all of the recommendations, is that something you're looking at, or are you satisfied that your issues and concerns can be met, meeting with the VP of IWK, well, I guess it wouldn't be IWK, but the new health authority? Just wondering, are you looking at the Deputy Minister of Health as potentially someone to meet with?
So deputy ministers receive copies of a draft of the audit report. We didn't, in this case, meet with the Deputy of Health.
Well, prescription monitoring, though, I would think would be more, would it be not more of a responsibility of the Department of Health to really push the changes that are needed to address the gaps and the shortfalls in the audit?
So the recommendations were to the Department of Health, keeping in mind we did not have a disagreement with the department on the fact that these are not complete. So the department said, you know, these are not complete. There was no request on their part to meet with us. Now, people on the team, and if Ms. Coleman Sad wants to add to this, people on the team would have met with officials at the Department of Health in doing this work.
Okay. And going continuing on the theme around the prescription monitoring program, the audit was done in 2012. What was the response of the department at the time? Were you satisfied with that response? And maybe just a bit of a comment on at the time after that audit, how did you find the department responded to that audit of the prescription monitoring program?
So if you're okay with this, I'm going to focus on the 4 recommendations that continue to not be implemented as of this point in time when we did this audit work. So there were 4 recommendations, all of which were agreed to by the Department of Health at the time. And in going back to the recommendations, the responses from the department were very concrete, which is great. They had timelines, which are wonderful, and they indicated that the work would be done in 2014. That's not the case, not so wonderful.
Yeah, and definitely I think that's the concern I think Nova Scotians have, and we have. You know, there was a commitment, and we know that there has been a change in government. I was minister at the time, and the work and the issue of the prescription monitoring program was taken very seriously by the department. And I think, as you indicated, a detailed response and a timeline. I believe response out of the minister yesterday about why they may be off track. One was contributed to the amalgamation of the District Health Authority, which I think we would have to all agree. When you're taking on that task, it would delay the work being done within the district, but more importantly within the department. Are you satisfied that was kind of an answer from the government?
So I'm not going to, you know, recognizing that we cut off at a point in time, I'm not going to try to assess the commentary by the Minister of Health. You know, we cut off on October 15. The department indicated it's not yet complete. That's where I would stop.
Okay, thank you. The other area, which may not be as well known, as former minister, a lot of the work is on the shoulders of the deputy ministers. On the Deputy Minister of Health, as minister, you know, you turn to your deputy to say, okay, there's an audit done, there's some serious issues that we need to address. Please run with this and keep us updated. Unfortunately, one of the first things with the change in government, of course, there'll be some delay. We have to expect that. But in the Department of Health, one of the first decisions they made was to let go or fire the Deputy Minister of Health, former Deputy Kevin McNamara, which I know the work that deputy did, or any deputies previous, is huge. And I have to link this delay not only to the amalgamation, but to a change in deputy ministers, especially in an important department like health. And maybe you can't comment, maybe it is best for the minister to comment, but would you have seen that move contributing to delay in implementing recommendations, especially in the Department of Health?
So I believe that the explanations for the delays really should come from the department, and I shouldn't attempt to explain that. Keeping and recognizing as well, and I know I continue to make this point, when an organization says they're not complete and they acknowledge they haven't done that recommendation as they said they would, you know, we put a box around it and then we report not complete.
So what concerns me also is that the follow-up is on a cycle base, and unfortunately this issue around prescription monitor will fall off that cycle. What assurances do we have? Are you going to be looking back further than that 2-year cycle for another update down the road? Are we going to continue to still see maybe an update in your upcoming audits, like we did in the past about recommendations? I know you're trying to pull a lot of that out for this report, but in future reports or in future audits, are you still going to have a section in there about recommendations and follow up on and implementation of those recommendations?
So a couple of points to respond to. Firstly, because we no longer follow up, I believe the government doesn't take that as not being important or that they shouldn't do it. I mean, the reassurance I get from government people is they agree these things to continue to be important. Secondly, when something is important and we make a recommendation around it and we believe that it's not implemented and it continues to be important, we will look at that and evaluate from a risk perspective whether that's something we should be auditing. So we make choices just like anybody else makes, and if we think that one of these audits still haven't been implemented, just because they fall off of a follow-up year doesn't mean we can't re-audit something as well. Or it doesn't mean we can't follow it up as part of some other audit that we may be doing in that area.
So just on the one question around your future audits, are you going to continue to just have a standalone report of follow-up, or will you continue to put in some of the recommendations completed, maybe, or percentage in your audits? Is it June the next audit report would come out?
So we'll do the follow-up report as a standalone separate report from now on, like we just did. Okay, and that will list the ones that are complete, not complete, all of the status. So we'll continue to do that in the spring of each year. Our June report in this year will just be on 3 new audits and whatever findings and recommendations we may make in those 3 audits.
Okay, thank you for that. I am a bit concerned. I know you're concerned with the implementation and the rate. As we said, we're 60% now, and 40% not, 60% completed, 40% not completed. And the concern is, as the new audits come on, the attention, of course, will be on those, and less attention on these. And I hope that we are able to continue to have the government be accountable to that. When there's a disagreement, or the department or the government decides now that they disagree with you, where are we left as a committee on pressuring or trying to engage the department on the importance of the recommendations from your office? Is it just that they disagree with your recommendations and that's the end of it? What could the committee do to maybe continue the discussion on maybe trying to get the government to understand that the recommendations out of the audits that you do are important, and what avenue do you have to continue to maybe have an argument or a stage to make sure that the government your reasoning behind this is important. I don't know if you understand where I'm coming from, but what do we do as a committee, and how can we improve or try to improve the discussion to continue on when there's a disagreement between a department and your office?
So one suggestion I would respectfully make to the committee is that there are really two organizations in this report where there is disagreement. Right? I mean, there's 28 recommendations. 17 of the 20 where the government says are no longer applicable and we disagree. 17 of those is with the Department of Business. So perhaps I could suggest that you bring the Department of Business in, have the discussion. If you want us at we're always here anyway, but if certainly you can pose questions to us at the same time. And maybe you could ask the department in preparation to say, take those 17 recommendations and explain why the fundamentals of those recommendations no longer apply to a new funding program. I would also respectfully suggest that with the Department of Education, you could do the same thing and say, while you agreed to these before, why do they suddenly become under the bucket of we are no longer going to do these? And again, I would offer us as potential witnesses as well, and we can have that discussion. The other thing I would add is if we feel that an exposure continues, for example, on homeschooled children, and the government says they're not going to implement the recommendations because they decided not to, we could go re-audit that area with a new scope, with heavier involvement in terms of focus on outputs. There's nothing to prevent us from going back and re-auditing and getting into more detail and perhaps focus even more on a different aspect of it. Not to come up with the same recommendations, that might be silly, but to bring new information even out in an audit to the committee, to make the case, to say, here are the impacts, and to make our case. If we feel strongly about it, we hold that option as well.
So do you get requests from the general public on areas of government that maybe you should audit? I know opposition parties have called in the past on certain issues that kind of are sensitive or are being seen upon by the public as an area that we need to look at. So do you get requests from the general public on this is an area of concern, and maybe you're fielding more emails and more phone calls about a certain department or a certain program?
I think it's fair to say I get requests all of the time, and my colleagues to my left and right often end up responding to people as well. Very often, very often the inquiries are, hit to your heart, but you say, oh, what a sad situation, but is there really an audit there? Or, can we really use resources? So I take all of those seriously when we get those, but, sometimes we will get, various inquiries from everything from education to healthcare.
Okay, thank you. Going through, of course, the follow-up from 2012, 2013, many of the recommendations, especially around health, and some of the others fell onto organizations that no longer exist. So, of course, if there's a change in the makeup of the department, amalgamation of the district health authorities, often I noticed many of the recommendations had to deal with Capital Health, for example. So, with this change in responsibility, does the onus fall on the new department, the new identity, to follow up with the recommendations? And are you concerned that because there is a change, and potentially a change in senior level directors, managers, deputy ministers, that your recommendations kind of fall off the table of who was or who were in charge of addressing them? Do you have any concern that has happened? And there's been a lot of movement in the last year with a number of departments, health authorities especially.
One thing I've learned in 27 years in federal and provincial public sector is that there are always changes. One thing that concerns me that we noted in the report is that when there are changes, in programs or reorganization, that previous recommendations get lined up to the new organization as relevant. And we provided an example where that didn't happen. I think that should concern the Public Accounts Committee. Recommendations shouldn't fall off a table because somebody doesn't bring them to the right new organization. I don't find that is good oversight of the recommendations. Now, we have good examples, like I would give credit to the Health Authority, for example, for taking the previous recommendations on capital planning and saying, we're going to put those in the bucket of not complete because we want to apply these recommendations across the board to the new Health Authority. So there are positive examples, I believe, where an organization will take those recommendations and appropriately apply them. But the first scenario I outlined, that just should not happen. I mean, somebody needs to be overseeing these things and sharing them and giving them out.
Order. We'll now move to the Liberal Caucus and Mr. Rankin.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I just wanted to say it's good to see this report, and especially the addition of the overview document. I think it's helpful for committee members and probably helpful for every member in the House to see that. And just to continue on the discussion about the recommendations falling off, I was going to ask about that actually, because you know you have a lot of recommendations, and so for the prescription monitoring program, 13 have been completed, but 4 are remaining. So just the committee seems to me now has to take over and ensure that those 4 are followed up with. So I think there's a huge opportunity for PAC to bring in these departments and focus on addressing the recommendations and assist the Auditor General. So that's the whole idea of when I was speaking to the committee on numerous times over the last several months to try to resist bringing in political issues and focus on the issues that are to do with the administration and improving on the recommendations. So I appreciate the recommendation to bring in business and education, and I think we can do the same thing with health. We have multiple avenues to improve these recommendations. We have the official endorsement, which I'll move later from the committee. We have the frequency of meetings, which is more than any other province in Canada, I've learned. And we have the audit committee, and we have the tracking system. So I'm wondering, I guess I'll ask a question, how you feel the effectiveness of the tracking system is working, and how the tagger system I'm speaking to, and if all departments are using it in a uniform type of way. And I'm just not certain that who's accountable for that. Would that be the audit committee? Is that your understanding? And I know we're going to look to bringing in the audit committee, so we'll see how that's going to work. But how do you feel that system is working? Is it improving the way that departments are held accountable?
Mr. Pickup.
I do want to indicate before I turn it to my colleagues if they want to add anything on the detail. So we are not auditing here sort of that system of Tagger and looking at the structures in place, the process to see what can improve better. Because that frankly would be a small audit on its own, sort of an oversight type of audit. We're focusing here on the results. So to me, the results speak for themselves in terms of how well is that process working or not working. So I think it's great that you're suggesting, bring the committee in, have more discussion on it, but we really didn't audit. Here's 10 things that can work better in that system. We rely on the information that organizations put into the system. I would also encourage you maybe to ask organizations when they come in, what control processes do they have in place to make sure they're updating the system and that the system is working for them. I'll see if Ms. Coleman-Sad wants to add anything now.
Okay, and I did ask before, and you said the Department of Health gave a specific timeline to try to complete by 2014. Is that consistent with the other departments? Do the departments typically give timelines, or do you recommend timelines on these recommendations?
So firstly, I would, one of the things that we're talking to entities about is when they respond in the recommendations, if they can put timelines in and very tangible things that they can be held to account for, helps the committee, helps Nova Scotians, and helps us as well. I don't have a sense of, say, of these 400 recommendations, X number had timelines in them. If Ms. Coleman-Sad has any sense of that, she could add to it. But we are also encouraging organizations to, if they think they're not going to get something done within 2 years, say that in the response. If they think something is going to take 3 years or 4 years, have that in the response so that people, you know, manage their expectations, and then they can come to a committee like the Public Accounts Committee and say, this is going to take us X period of time, this is why, and then you can have the discussion with them to see how valid you think that is. Do you want to add anything that Ms. Coleman said?
Ms. Coleman-Sad?
No, I guess when we originally discussed the recommendations, we always suggest that if they have timelines, it's great to include. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. So we don't require that they include that, but we always suggest that if they do. And the other thing that we always discuss when we discuss recommendations when they're initially made is, you know, do you feel this is implementable? Do you feel is this a recommendation that you feel is reasonable and practical, and all of those sorts of things, because it's not in anyone's best interest for recommendations not to be practical and implementable. So we try to have those discussions when the audit comes about to start with, which I think is why you see a very small number disagreed with.
So if they say that they don't think that's feasible within that sort of 2-year timeline, do you still go ahead with the recommendation, or is that kind of a judgment call to figure out if it's, if you think it's reasonable? I guess you might not think that it's reasonable that it won't be happening in 2 years.
I think it really is a judgment. I think it really is a judgment call, but I would say that, you know, in the overwhelming majority of cases, we are not into a disagreement on a recommendation, and I think it goes to how we scope an audit, how we plan an audit, how we hit the risk areas, so that when we know what questions we can answer at the end, the department knows where we're going, they have the audit objectives, they have the criteria. You know, we're in the business of trying to improve government by making suggestions to departments that they want to do and will do. So it's very rare, I think, that we really get into an argument at the end as to whether a recommendation is feasible, makes sense.
Right. And yeah, and I think that the member from Sappho-Cobequid mentioned some real factors that come into play with, you know, change in deputies, change in government. Actually, there's an election since 2012. But I do see almost 80% recommendation implementation rate from the PMP program, which is better than most. I know that is the one that has a lot of the attention from members and the media. But with 13 complete, and you've said that all of them are virtually high risk. We talked about possibly ranking low, medium, high. So you recognize 13 that are complete to be high risk over 2 years. I would ask the question, have the controls and monitoring of effectiveness for the prescription monitoring program improved since 2012, just as a basic question?
So I think I would stick to, we are satisfied that 13 of the 17 recommendations have been acted upon, which is a positive thing, because they would have addressed an observation of something that wasn't happening. So those would have gone to reducing risk areas. But I would also point out that, you know, while only 4 of 17 remain in the incomplete, some risks continue.
Some risks continue, right? But out of the 13, with the logic that they're just as high a risk, those 13 are just as important to implement than the 4 that are outstanding that presumably the department are working on.
Right, so it's progress.
Right. Okay.
Notwithstanding the fact that some things remain.
Right. Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Mr. Stroink?
Thank you very much. I guess I kind of want to touch base on the education part, on the homeschooling part. I guess, you know, this was, like you said, this was implemented in 2012 with the recommendations of the department. And when you look at that, that was the decision of the government at the time to make all the recommendations. And I think at this point, I don't think, looking at all the information here, that the minister at the time actually looked to see if those recommendations were doable on the legality of the recommendations. So, when you look at the legal rights of a parent and an educator for homeschool, I mean, those parents make the choice to homeschool their children based on maybe religion or what they want to do. The Department of Education then forwards that, gives them the support tools to do with the Nova Scotia curriculum. Those kids flourish in universities once they graduate out of the homeschool sector. So the question really is, the department cannot, and I don't think the department can legally actually implement this because of the right of the Education Act. So then that's why they're not able to do those. So how can that, so that's kind of one portion of it. The other portion of this is if the new government that comes in, and what we talked to about how the government has a new direction or a new view or a new opinion or a new thought or a new whatever, where they want to head, then these become nil and void too. So they're always going to remain under the books in your agreement that you feel that they need to happen, but in the Department of Education, they feel legally they can't do it. So in that kind of impasse, this will never be completed. So it looks bad on the department saying this will never be completed.
Mr. Pickup?
So my comment would be, we continue to stand by the recommendations, with the focus of this being that the outcomes of children that are homeschooled should be assessed to know how they are doing. So if they're all doing wonderful, great, and maybe there are things to be learned from that. If some of them aren't doing well, does somebody know that, and is somebody helping to fix that? So that's really what it focused on.
So, and I guess my question is, legally, does the province have a right or to go into someone's home and see this when they've made a choice to homeschool their children based on religion or based on other views or thoughts?
So when we did this audit, which was a few years ago now, and the department agreed with the recommendations, there was no response that this was not within the legal authority of the province. So the response at the time was, we agree with these recommendations. So, at the time, legality of this was not a consideration.
Right, and we could argue that at that time, what maybe happened is that the minister at the time just said, yeah, we'll take them all, because it was the Auditor General's, and not looking really at the recommendations clearly to see if there was any legality issues within those recommendations.
So, I won't attempt to speak for previous ministers, but I would say is we go through a pretty healthy clearance process with the entities that we audit, so that when we get to the end of an audit and we get an agreed to implement a recommendation, it isn't based on 5 minutes of work. It's based on the departments having spent, a considerable amount of time and discussion with our office.
But the Auditor General doesn't look at the legality of the recommendations that they're putting forward to see if there actually can be
If at the time
based on the Education Act. There seems to be a little bit of a void here, because you're making a recommendation that kind of goes against the Education Act.
So at the time, when the recommendation was agreed to, the legality of this was not raised as an inhibitor of being able to do this, or I assume it would have been raised at the time. Mr. Spicer, to my left, was in charge of this audit, so if he wants to add a comment to your question, feel free.
Mr. Spicer?
Yeah, and I would obviously agree with Mr. Pickup wholeheartedly that when we would have done this, we would have looked at the Education Act, and if there is a legal agreement or legal opinion that says this is not possible, we haven't been provided with that. But however, the Education Act does allow the minister to ask for information and certain information and do certain things, and we still believe that these recommendations that we've made fall under the Education Act and would apply to that. So you had mentioned about going into a home and looking at a student in there. Well, that's only one of many options as to how you could assess a child. So, our recommendations are fairly broad to say the Department of Education
you know, there's many ways you can do this. So, I mean, have a look at those things and do it so that it does comply with the act.
But could you argue in this situation that if they graduate out of the homeschool situation and go forward because of the great work that's been done at the homeschool level, that they've graduated based on the Nova Scotia curriculum and are now accepted into a university or into a community college, that's the mark that says that they've succeeded?
And for those kids, I would say yes. But, I mean, I think it's reasonable, and the reality is that not all of the kids do that. So our focus for this audit was to make sure that those kids that they have a process to identify those kids that aren't getting the education that they should get, however the Department of Education defines that. As an example, the report mentioned there is a public school curriculum, but that's only one option. The Department of Education could monitor that or could change that in any way they saw fit. But the emphasis of the report is really about how do you identify those kids that are not getting an appropriate education, not those that are. And that's really the focus, I think, that's critical in this chapter.
And I guess just a little bit more on this, because I think we're having a good dialogue here. My struggle that I'm having with this is that we have a past government in 2012 that had one direction, and then you have a new government that comes in, going back to think, who has a different direction, who has a different philosophy or a different belief, or doesn't, or has a different format of the education rights. That's, to me, that doesn't even seem to be playing into this discussion, because you're saying, nope, this is it, and not having any consideration of what the new direction or the new government is trying to do in that relationship. So this will be at an impasse, because this will always be on the books as incompleted.
Mr. Pickup?
So, Ms. Coleman Sad just pointed out for me that the language of the Education Act is very similar to our recommendation, so that it's very much taken from there. To your comment slash question in terms of changes in government, governments may make decisions, and it may be decided, for example, not to do this. We continue to feel that it's important. So while we disagree on that, we disagree, and things go on.
So then you could say, I mean, based on disagreement, then that chapter is pretty much complete. I'll end it there, and I'll turn it over to my colleagues.
The only comment I would make on that is I would talk less about sort of legalities of it and less about complete or incomplete and more about the students themselves. I mean, this is about young people, and the audit was all about how does the department make itself comfortable, and if part of the answer is A, B, C, D, E, F, G, outline that for people and tell people where that comfort is coming from.
But that's what the Nova Scotia education curriculum is for those ABCs and for those children to succeed. I mean, homeschool parents have a phenomenal amount of support. They're incredible educators. They're incredible people that make the Nova Scotia kids homeschooled succeed. And the success rate on those kids is very high. So, I mean, those are because you look at the amount of people that come out of the homeschool system and graduate and move on into universities and stuff like that. Anyways, we're going to go back and forth, and it doesn't matter. I mean, that's just my thought. It's your thought. So I'll just pass it on to my colleagues.
Okay, Mr. Wilson, you have just a bit over 2 minutes remaining.
Oh, I don't know whether I should thank you or not. Thank you. Good. The Jobs Fund. That's Department of Business. I'll be very quick and pointed on these. Very distinguished difference between the Jobs Fund and Invest Nova Scotia. Can you elaborate to me why you would like to link them together, even though they're so different?
Mr. Pickup.
Sure. So we recognize that the approach to funding has changed, and on that there is no disagreement. Why we think these recommendations continue to be relevant is I'll give you some examples that we think apply to any funding program. There should be disbursement controls before payment is made. We think that's still relevant. the board or the approval body should get complete and accurate information before they make a decision. That continues to apply to any funding program. There should be a checklist to ensure compliance with the arrangements of the funding approach. Continue to apply to any funding mechanism. There should be a complete analysis of a decision to fund. So we recognize that the Jobs Fund no longer exists, but you can sort of put any funding arrangement in front of these recommendations, and it's hard to argue with the fact that disbursement controls over payments is key and basic in financial management and control.
Great. No, I couldn't agree with you more also. I'm curious then, have you done any kind of a review on the Invest Nova Scotia procedures and guidelines around that funding?
So no, so we haven't done an audit of that funding arrangement that is still, being developed. I would say Ms. Coleman said, and I did meet with the Deputy Minister of Business and have some discussion in terms of whether they're going to look at these recommendations and how they might be relevant.
Good.
Did you want to? Okay.
Okay, thank you. No, those are two important points, I think, to make, to try and see how we can move forward with these 17 recommendations, because to be quite honest with you, all of us hope the job fund is gone. We want it to be gone. It was a bad fund. We know it wasn't set up well.
I do apologize for interrupting, but we have run out of time. We'll move to Mr. Houston for 14 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I do see we had some visitors join us, so welcome to the young folks there with us this morning. It's very appropriate as we're talking about as education. And I do want to follow up on my colleagues' I guess challenge of the validity of your recommendations. Did those departments, the recommendations around homeschooling will not be implemented, but the Auditor General's office didn't withdraw them? When through the process of the department saying that they won't be implemented, did they raise a question over whether you were asking them to do something illegal?
Mr. Pickup.
No, I did not receive that question. The discussion really was on, we are not going to implement this, and on our end it was, we still believe these things are relevant.
If a department felt you were asking them to do something illegal, surely they'd probably tell you.
I would hope that before a recommendation is agreed to, as it was in this audit, that any questions around legality of something would indeed be addressed at that time. And these recommendations were agreed to.
Okay, thank you. I did want to run through a couple of the recommendations. I just lost my page there, so my colleague might be able to find it. But in Chapter 4 of the May 2012 report, it was around the infection prevention and control at the Nova Scotia Health Authority, and it talked about discontinuing the use of spray wands. And I kind of remember a little bit when that was in the media at the time. It was found that spray wands as a disinfecting tool, I guess, weren't very effective. I see this recommendation still on the books as not completed. So does that mean that the department's still using spray wands to disinfect?
Ms. Coleman said.
So that recommendation related to the former Capital Health, and I would take the fact that it is not complete to mean that there would still be locations within what was the former Capital Health that would be using spray wands, yes.
Okay. And the recommendation to, do you recall the reasoning behind the recommendation to discontinue the use of spray wands?
So my recollection of that is that a lot of that related to C. difficile outbreaks that we had in the province at the time, and the fact that using spray wands sometimes in patient washrooms right on the unit, if you've got one patient that has C. difficile and another patient in a ward setting who does not have that, then using a spray wand in the washroom can, I guess, push bacteria into the air and aerosolize things. And that was the concern, was that the spray wands could contribute to the spread of.
Okay. Okay, thank you. I did notice if a recommendation is complete, you wouldn't have looked at that at all, would you? Because I did notice that there was in the August 2013 report, there was a review of MLA Sampson's entitlement to benefits as an outside member, and there was a recommendation that the office of the Speaker should seek repayment from Mr. Sampson for inappropriate claims listed in this report, and the status is complete. Do you know if there was a repayment required, or if they said it was complete, would you have looked at it?
I don't remember the specifics of that particular recommendation. I can tell you that we do look at all recommendations that government management put forward to us and say are complete, and we look at whether or not, from a review level of assurance, they are complete. So that's not as high a level as an audit, it's not as high a standard, but we do generally look at some information that is provided from them to see that a recommendation is complete.
Okay, thank you for that. And I want to talk quickly about the transportation, the recommendations around inventory control and this type of stuff. And I was when I was reading this, I was kind of thinking of that old Johnny Cash song, the 54, 55, 56 Chevrolet, and we always hear stories of, you think are way back in the past, of factories weighing workers on the way in and weighing them on the way out and that type of stuff. But you do think of that as something that would have happened way in the past with the way that there'd be control around inventories now. But it seems like you've identified some serious weaknesses at the Department of Transportation around inventory control and made some recommendations, and there hasn't been a move to address those risks. Is that a fair summary? That there's a very real risk there of misappropriation of assets, just on the basis of the way the procedures are set up. Is that fair?
Mr. Pickup.
There are over 20 key controls, what we consider basics, over inventory control and management. When controls to that extent are not in place, it creates risks of inappropriate things happening, for example. So given this audit was in May of 2013, we feel it should be implemented by now.
Mm-hmm. And there wouldn't have been, would the department be able to, you might not have looked at this, but presumably they would be able to look at what they've had to reorder, they should be able to kind of do a reasonableness check on the assets in their kind of inventory. Were they doing any of that? Would they argue that, well, there's another, this risk is mitigated for this reason? I guess if they would have proposed something that mitigated the risk, you would have assessed whether it did or not, and if it didn't, you'd have made a recommendation. Is that kind of how it would have worked?
Sorry, Mr. Spicer.
Yeah, that's correct. We would have looked at the information that was available. We would have done a lot of testing. In fact, all of these recommendations come from the fact that we would have done detailed testing there and identified those as control weaknesses that should have been addressed.
Mm-hmm. And can you elaborate a little bit on the opportunity for money back rebates based on purchasing? So there was the department, if they purchased from certain vendors, I guess, or certain materials, had an opportunity under the agreements that were in place to receive some rebates, but they never took that opportunity?
That I think you're referring to the life cycle cost agreements that they had, and are still some of them are in effect. But basically, those agreements they're a guarantee by the supplier that this particular vehicle or piece of equipment will only cost you so much to repair and maintain over a certain amount of time. So they have those agreements. So part of our process was to go in to look to see, well, how are you monitoring that? How do you know what are the costs associated with that piece of equipment, so that in fact, if it does exceed that limit that's there, that you know the amount that you're supposed to go back to the supplier to get. So we know that there was some control weaknesses there as well that we pointed out that they should be fixing.
Was there, did you, in the course of your audit, did you see any situations where rebates were actually received, where they had filed and received rebates on those?
Yeah, I'd have to, I can't remember exactly the details on.
Okay, so it could be that there was a system in place, but the system could be improved.
Yes, there was a system in place, and it could be improved. And in fact, many of the recommendations in that report kind of link to that, because in order to be able to have an accurate amount to know how much you should go back for, you need to make sure that your work orders are correct, that all the supplies and repairs and equipment that you're using on particular vehicles is getting charged to those vehicles, that it's being done on a timely basis. So there's a number of the recommendations that in fact impact on their ability to monitor those guarantees and life cycle cost agreements.
Mm-hmm. And some of those agreements would still be in place, so this is still definitely relevant, this recommendation.
Yes, I believe some of them, yeah, there's 3 or 4 that are still, will end, I think, in late 16 or 17.
Okay. Okay, well, that's very interesting, actually. And I did want to look at another recommendation from May 2012, addictions services, health and wellness. And it talked about, this recommendation seems like it was specific to Annapolis Valley Health, but it talked about the need to monitor outcomes of addiction services programs. And first off, I wonder if you have any ability to say whether this recommendation would have applied to other health authorities at the time.
Ms. Coleman-Sad?
So the recommendation, at that time, we were only doing an audit of addiction services, if I'm looking at the right audit, at Annapolis Valley. So it would have only applied to that, what was that former district health authority, because that's the only thing we would have been looking at that point in time.
So at that point in time, that health authority had no basis for determining whether the services it was providing, it couldn't tell you what the outcomes were of those services. Is that, do I read that correctly?
So what we're getting at there is that they needed to implement outcome monitoring. So they needed to monitor to see what the outcomes were of their services. I don't remember a great deal of detail about what sort of led to that recommendation, but I do know that that was what was at the heart of it, was to implement an outcome monitoring process. So something that looks at, are your services working? Are they doing what you intend them to do?
Mm-hmm. Okay. And it's probably always wise to monitor the outcomes of programs and services you're providing, so it would be disappointing that that wasn't happening. Maybe it was happening, just not in an organized fashion?
I'm just trying to refresh my memory on it really quickly. So at that time, what we reported was that there was an outside agency that did some outcome monitoring for some of its structured treatment and nicotine programs, but that there was no outcome monitoring or other assessment for other programs at Annapolis.
Okay.
So at that point in time, there wasn't any outcome monitoring except for those 2 areas.
Okay. And I appreciate this, the work done in this report, and I do think it gives some good direction to this committee that hopefully we can act upon as we schedule witnesses coming forward, for sure. And I'm hopeful that, I think the majority of these recommendations, they're not recommendations that should be dismissed or elevated based on the change of a government. I think these are recommendations that work to protect taxpayers, whether it's protecting the assets of the province or making sure services are doing what they're supposed to. I don't see a lot of political sensitivity in these types of recommendations, and I'm sure you probably take pride in that from your office, that they're very matter of fact. Is that how you would see it?
Mr. Pickup.
My comment would be on the 161 not complete. is that there's very few that we are under disagreement on, and those ones that we are under disagreement on, we think they continue to be relevant. We are always careful when we get into sort of policy-type decisions that a government may make, right? So we really try to focus on, the efficiency and effectiveness of government and how government works, recognizing what can happen and what ought to happen within that. So we very much stand by the 161 recommendations, and I don't want to lose sight that in the overwhelming majority of these cases, 93%, the government agrees. So yes, we have some disagreement on this box of things that we think are still important, but for the most part, we still have agreement.
Order. Thank you. Move to the NDP Caucus, and Ms. Zan for
Thank you so much.
14 minutes.
How much?
14 minutes.
Okay, thank you. And also, I have to agree with my colleagues. It's a very good report and very thorough and very interesting. One question I'd like to ask is about, well, the addiction services. For one thing, I really agree that the Nova Scotia prescription monitoring program needs to be obviously dealt with in a much better fashion. We've been having a lot of problems with that, and a lot of young people dying and across the province, and not just young people, but others as well. And in my riding in particular, there have been some suicides because of this problem. And so I can't state enough how urgent this is. So I'm really glad to see you flag that. The other one I wanted to mention about health and wellness and addiction services at Annapolis Valley was 3.8, that the Department of Health and Wellness should implement a single province-wide intake and wait list for withdrawal management programs. So my question about that is, what rationale has the Department of Health given to not implement this one singular wait list for withdrawal management?
Ms. Coleman-Sad?
So at the time, the department provided a response to that recommendation. They didn't agree with the recommendation. Part of what they said was that clinicians hadn't identified that as an area of concern. We believe then, and we continue to believe, that it is important to have a single source of intake and a single wait list so that people are not, it's clear where people need to call if they need those services. They can call one place, and it's clear that, a particular individual is not on 4 different wait lists. They're on one wait list. There's a clear picture of how many people do you have waiting for that service in the province, versus if you have different wait lists in different areas, it's very difficult to know how many people you have waiting for a service.
Exactly. So did they give a reason why they felt it was not important to implement it?
So when we went back and did our follow-up work, we would not have gotten into a great deal of detail on that. It's still listed as do not intend to implement. Because they disagreed with it to start with, that one wasn't, I guess, unexpected that it might be listed as do not intend to implement.
Yes.
Mr. Pickup?
Just add that if you have the opportunity to have the department here, they may be able to shed a little more insight as to why they did not intend to implement.
Right. Okay, thank you very much. I'd also like to move on and ask some of the questions. I'm the education critic, so I'm curious about the education piece. So I noticed, so you did have 12 recommendations, and there are 6 that they are saying that they do not intend to implement. And I had one question in particular is, how were you able to drill down into finding out what exactly you feel is missing in the homeschooling department in Nova Scotia? What research was done on that?
I'm just going to quickly take the first part of that, and then I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Spicer, who would have led that audit at the time. So if we go to sort of the core part of the recommendations, what we're essentially saying is You should have clear, measurable learning objectives. Do an independent child assessment. Assess the programs that parents are proposing for outcomes. As you do the assessments, document them. Get information on the progress of the students, where you need to take action on an assessment, document and take the action. So I do want to point to these things as being sort of what we feel are sort of basic monitoring and assessment of a program of an area. Now, that's sort of the preamble to what Mr. Spicer may like to add to that.
Okay, great, thanks.
Mr. Spicer?
So as far as the actual detailed audit, we would have talked to school boards a little bit to understand their involvement, but we also would have done a lot of detailed testing right at the Department of Education, looking at the files and information that they receive. So all of our recommendations are based on that look at what information do you get, what information do you request.
And thank you very much. And one question I had is, so in preparing children who are homeschooled for universities, let's say, is there enough information there for you to be able to see whether or not kids are they're educated well enough to go into universities, or how does that all take place? How does that happen?
I would say, based on the recommendations that we've made here, based on our look at the files, there would be no way for them to know whether they were prepared or not. Now, having said that, I think before they go into universities, the universities do some testing to see sort of where they are and you know, where they would fall from a registration point of view. But based on our review of the files back in 2012, and again, if you look at these recommendations as to what's not being done, you can conclude that there would be very difficult for them to know whether they were getting the education that they needed to do that.
Right.
Mr. Pickup?
At the risk of sounding repetitive, I would also encourage you, if the Department of Education comes in, to focus with them on how then are you managing the risk. If the risk here is of children with not sure of the outcomes of these children, right? If you're not doing these things, how are you managing that risk to know that this pool of the student population is progressing as you would hope?
Right. Thank you very much. I also had another question relating to what Mr. Houston had asked earlier. Mr. Houston had asked about Mr. Samson's expenses back. At one point in time, it was reported that he was claiming certain fees for travel back and forth to his home that he apparently wasn't staying at, and it was suggested that he repay those. Did you say that you don't know whether or not that actually happened or not?
Ms. Coleman-Sad?
Do you know which recommendation that is? I'm just trying to, I know we would have done work around whether or not it was complete. So if it says complete, then I would say that they sought repayment.
It's on page 59?
Yes, yeah. I would say that they sought repayment if it says it's complete, because we would have, I don't remember the specifics of that one, but.
I'm sorry, did you say they sought repayment?
Well, I'm looking at specific nature, so I can't say for sure whether or not it was repaid. I may be able to find that really quickly. If you want to move on to another area, I might have some
Mr.
info on
Pickup
that.
with a comment?
Sure. A brief comment I would say is that, you know, we're dealing with 400 recommendations, so we don't mean to frustrate you, but it can take a little bit of time. And on these complete ones, it's a rather generic answer, but we need to be satisfied to a review level and agree on the complete status versus those not complete ones. And once an entity, once the organization say not complete, we're done and we put a box around those.
Oh, I see. Okay. And also, I seem to remember, just in response to Tim Houston, that there was a change of government. Oh, it went to the ombudsman at that point in time, or the conflict of interest commissioner, I believe. and the Conflict of Interest Commissioner made a ruling.
Ms. Coleman said.
So sorry, on your question on recommendation 2.6, I found the answer. I didn't remember it offhand, but the notes that I have here say that we did review, so yes, it was repaid.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. And I think that's all I have today. I think it's a very, very good report, and I really appreciate you going to all this work. And the this little page, the pager, is fantastic. It really helps. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Sand. If there are no further questions from the NDP Caucus, we'll move to the Liberal Caucus. Mr. Wilson.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Just to finish off on my last round of questions, thank you with the Jobs Fund. The new Invest Nova Scotia way that we're doing business, you haven't had a chance to do any kind of a review or audit on that. And I'm wondering, is this something that might be identified as a way for us to move forward and deal with those 17 recommendations? Is it on your radar for potentially a review?
Mr. Pickup.
So in any case where recommendations are not implemented, as we monitor what's happening in government on a regular basis and make our audit plans, recognizing we do 8 to 10 performance audits a year, we'll keep an eye to this, as we will many other factors, and then decide somewhere down the road whether this is something we scope into our audit plan or not.
Okay, thank you. The reason I ask is because, well, actually last night was quite interesting during estimates. We had some very timely questions as a result of your report being tabled, and I guess coincidentally the Minister of Business was at estimates last night, so I'm guessing you didn't watch Ledge TV last night, but there were some very good back and forth questions around that, and I think a lot of the answers to the questions were given during that time, that back and forth. I do know that it was very clear that they really respected and did appreciate the work that was done on the 17 recommendations around the Jobs Fund, recognizing there were some serious issues with that fund. And also, there were some comments around, there was a lot of learned experiences from that review that were incorporated into the Invest Nova Scotia strategy on how that was administered. As you're well aware, it's a private sector administered, it's independently led and sector focused. So that, I guess I'll just close with that and hope that there is a way to move forward in that area.
Mr. Pickup.
So my final comment on that would be in response. I would have been satisfied, I think, and comfortable if on these 17 recommendations the department had indicated not yet complete. I would have said, you know, that's reasonable, given you're going from the Jobs Fund into something new. We will look at these as we go forward, you know, recognizing that we'll have to put processes in place. And I think that would have been a perfectly reasonable explanation, and I would have been satisfied with that, to put it in the bucket of, okay, not complete yet, makes some sense, we'll keep an eye to it, we'll see what happens next year. It's when it moves to this bucket of no longer relevant that we then have a little more issue with, to say, okay, we don't want these to drop off, we want you to continue to look at these. So I hope the reasonableness of our approach and where we would prefer to be, you know, comes through sort of in our response to your questions.
Yeah. Very, very good point. I can't agree with you more. And that's an interesting segue into the next question, because you did mention there were several recommendations from the previous health authority alignment, where we had 9 different health authorities that get captured into the one health authority, and you were very pleased that these recommendations, although not dealt with at this point in time, they accepted those recommendations, and they would like to expand those recommendations across the province to all of the service delivery that we're seeing. And even though they're not completed, they are, in your mind, sort of that was an acceptable response at that time, I believe is the way that you put it. I'm curious, Do you know how many recommendations within the health authority would have fell within that category that would have been ones from previous health authorities?
Mrs. Coleman-Sad.
I believe there was around 37 recommendations grouped in that area.
So there's a couple of different audits that had recommendations to the former health authority. So there's one related to personal health information that doesn't fall into that category of them asking us that they want to make it applicable across the province. The ones that are applicable across the province was an audit that we did of capital planning at the Department of Health, and I'm just trying to find it quickly. And I'm sorry, it's not coming to me quickly, but that was an audit of capital planning at the Department of Health and Wellness, and also at some of the former health authorities. And in the health authorities case, they came to us and said, we would like to implement these changes across the new Nova Scotia Health Authority. So it applies to some of the, to that particular audit that was done, that was a former health authority, but it doesn't apply to others.
Right, so of, say, the 30-some that were there for the health authority, it could be 15, 20?
No, I think it's a much smaller number than
Okay.
that, because a very large number of them are the personal health information audit, and those ones are only applicable to the former capital and the IWK.
Okay, thank you. And that comes to my final points that I want to make. I think, you know, this is a tremendous, I call it actually a toolkit for government. And the earlier comments from my colleagues around prioritizing, I guess we've gone from one end of the scale, prioritizing, you know, categorizing, summarizing, ranking. They're all interesting words. I like the word summary because I think, again, the document that you gave us to start with is a tremendous snapshot. And if there are ways that we can bring in some of these other areas, I know that infrastructure, inventory, asset management is another group that we see across all government that I think needs to be focused on. You're going to do a review again next October. Is that the trigger point for that?
Mr. Pickup.
So the cutoff point for government will be October 16, and then we'll report in the spring, be it March or April.
Okay, so again, we're 6 months out from the last trigger point that we had, and the next one's 6 months from now. Can I ask where did the idea for this toolkit come from?
The toolkit that we've passed out today?
No, I'm sorry, the whole report that we have here. This is a trial, first time done. Where did the inception come from?
Okay, so we had, previously the office had always done a follow-up report in terms of a one chapter as part of a chapter or report in the spring. So there might be 3 new audits and then something called follow-up in there. Mm-hmm. Okay, so there had always been something on follow-up, and the approach to doing that may have changed over the years, but there was always something called follow-up. Now, when we had discussions with the chair and the vice chair over the last year, and given the interest in June of last year in the follow-up, we decided that we would pull it out and make it its own report, standalone snapshot. And then some of the other tools we gave you today was essentially us working together and trying to the extent we can put ourselves in the capacity you have today as a member of the Public Accounts Committee to sort of take 400 recommendations and follow what we're saying.
Okay, so it was an internal decision that was made to create this report then?
Essentially, yes.
Good. And it's early on, just my final question on this, again, I congratulate you. I think this is a tremendous tool for government. What do you see, maybe it's early on to ask that, and again, it is a trial, what do you see as maybe some of the changes that we might expect in the next report, as far as reporting, how we receive it, what it looks like? Do you think there's any?
You mean in terms of how we report or the results of the entities?
I would say the template that you're using.
Oh, so, you know, certainly one of the things we're going to try to do is take what we've given you that is not in the report and see how, you know, can we streamline the report, can we repackage, can we make it a little more user-friendly? Again, we'll look at the tools that we provided you today and see what we can make changes with based on some of the things that we heard today as well. So, you know, we very much believe a big part of what we do is obviously to serve the House, but it's also to serve this committee in addition to all of Nova Scotians. So to the extent we can get you the information that you can, you know, easily get through, the better we're doing our job in serving you. Ms. Coleman said wanted to make one quick point on something she was looking up.
Ms. Coleman said?
Thank you. So earlier you asked me about the number of recommendations that applied to the hospital system capital planning audit that the health authority had asked to have applied across the province. So there's 5 recommendations that are outstanding that their assessed is not complete, and the health authority indicated they want to implement them province-wide rather than just in the former districts.
Okay. Did they indicate to you in those discussions what timelines they had for implementing those?
No, I haven't had that discussion with them.
Okay. Thank you. That's it for me. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Wilson. Mr. Porter, you have about 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and I want to thank the Auditor General and staff in your office for preparing a report. I know there's a lot of work goes into doing that kind of detail, and we've had them over the years. I want to touch on just a couple of things with only a short few minutes left. When I look at the chart, you've talked about the importance. There's no real ranking. They're listed. You chart them on page 8 of the report, specifically, I think, based on the color coding and recognizing the percentages of where we are toward completion. I look at specifically the health one has been a key one you point out quite significantly in your chapter a little farther on, and you describe details around that. But it's in the 50 to 79% range, so there's work going on. Is that correct on this? Although it's not complete, there is work going on.
So the yellow one is the 50 to 79%. So that is better than 50% and not as good as 80.
Not as good as 80. But there is work going on. I want to clarify that nobody has said we're not working on anything. We are working on this. Is that correct?
Right, and I would also make the point, let's not forget that while it's only 60%, 240 recommendations essentially have been completed.
Correct.
So it's not,
Right.
it's not 0 or 1.
No, right. And I guess I just wanted to detail that because some of the questioning maybe didn't quite go into that, nor maybe some of the answers weren't quite that detailed around how much has been done and continues to be done. And I would think on some of these cases, with regards to the prescription monitoring, a very important case, you talk about it in the report farther on, the potential that exists there. I would assume, and please correct me if I'm wrong, and I'll look for your wisdom on this, but there's some expertise in putting this in place to get this right. Is that correct or no? Outside of government, sir, I'm talking about.
So I won't attempt to comment on what is involved in implementing this, in implementing the action. I would go back to the fact that in responding to the recommendation, the government itself decided that it would be done in 2014.
Okay.
Now, I think it's up to the Public Accounts Committee to have the discussion, why not 14, why 16?
Okay, but I guess in the audit process, and this is a fairly detailed audit of this section, and there are some, you use some language around this that obviously created some concern, rightfully so. But at the same time, in quantifying that, would it not mean that you need some sort of expertise to put this in place, and that should be weighed in this time it takes to put the solution and to complete the task?
So one of the things that we do, if we go back to that 161 not complete, of the 133 not complete, these are the ones that the entities say are not complete. Once we go into that not complete box, we're in the not complete box.
And you just leave it there?
Right, and we
There's
just
no
leave it
further-
there. We focus on the ones where government says they are complete to make sure we're reasonably happy based on review level that those are indeed complete. So that's where we focus.
Okay, so, and thank you for that. I just want to be clear. So you
Sure.
put them in the box. I'm
We
going
put
to use
them in
your
the
language.
box
Put them
and
in the
then-
box.
yes.
They're marked as not complete to date. Doesn't mean there's not progress. You've already said there's progress being made, there's work being done on that. But you don't look at the detail of what it takes to complete that task. Although you weigh in on, I guess I want to say you weigh in on strongly at times on certain things not being done when you weigh risk, for example, that we've talked about. So I guess in trying to be playing the other side of that, I'm not sure how you don't weigh in on what it takes to complete that when you look at the risk level.
So when we do the initial audit, you know, we find an observation. So generally, if we make a recommendation, we say something is not being done.
Okay?
So the something not being done and how you address that is really incumbent upon the department to come up with that action. And they take it seriously, and we acknowledge that, and they agree with the recommendation.
Right.
So then the timelines to do that and what has to be done is really up to the department.
Sure, sure. And realizing some of that takes more time, and there have been things that have happened, obviously.
I do apologize, but the time has expired. I'd like to take this opportunity, Mr. Pickup, for you to give some closing comments.
So my closing pre-lunch comments would be is firstly to thank you. Thank you for your interest in the work that we're doing. Thank you to the committee for calling in entities. Certainly, any chance I get, I always highlight, be it in public speeches or elsewhere, the importance of the Public Accounts Committee. And I think, one of the avenues that Nova Scotians should go to is their Public Accounts Committee and say, how well is the Public Accounts Committee holding government to account to make these changes? At the end of the day, we are the independent auditors, very much working for the House, for the committee, and for Nova Scotians as well. But we are there to encourage better government. We are there to encourage improvements, as all of you are here for in your role as Public Accounts Committee members. So that really is what is driving us when we look at all of these things. Now, 40% implementation, 40% rate of not implemented, yes, we have to say, that is significant. We do want to see improvement, but I acknowledge by the agreement, so does the public service, so does government. They want to do these things. So I think where I really see the Public Accounts Committee coming in to help is bringing some of these entities in to say, help us understand why it's taking you this amount of time, and are you being upfront to the extent you can be, and encouraged to do so, in your responses to tell people how long something is going to take in order to implement a recommendation. So I respectfully hope that the Public Accounts Committee will continue to call our work, as you have been, and call some of these organizations that aren't doing as well. And I would encourage that at the oversight level as well, as you have done with, for example, with some of the entities outside the core of government, like the Health Authority and the IWK. So again, I want to say, in my final word would be, thank you so much to the Evangeline Coleman-Sad, who's the Assistant Auditor General who led this. We're a small office, 36 people, pushing out 8 to 10 performance audits a year, doing all the financial audit work that we do on government, and then following up 23 audits and 400 recommendations. I spent 25 years at the Office of the Auditor General of Canada and have been here in Nova Scotia for the last 2 years. And just when I think I can't be impressed anymore, I continue to be impressed by the work that people in the office do. So it's not me, it's all of the people who are here today, and probably more importantly, the ones that are across the street in the building across the street who do all the real work and who may not even have time to do this. So that's my final thought.
Thank you, Mr. Pickup, and to Mr. Spicer, Ms. Coleman-Sad, thank you for your work in helping to make the province better for us all. We do have some committee business. We have some correspondence from the Department of Natural Resources. That was information requested from the April 6th meeting that we did have with them. Do members have any comments or questions about that correspondence? Seeing none, the next correspondence we had was from the Department of Community Services, and that related to information requested from the March 23rd meeting that we had with them. Is there any comments or questions on that? Seeing none, those are both quite straightforward. We've had a couple of requests to reschedule meetings. One the most recent one was just dated today, and this is from the Department of Education. And I'll draw your attention to a meeting scheduled for May the 11th. This, we received correspondence from the Deputy Minister of Education that they have been able to schedule a meeting with the 4 Atlantic clerks to meet with the McConnell Foundation about potential investment in early years in Atlantic Canada. So essentially, the deputy is requesting that, well, I guess we have 2 options. The meeting on the 11th has been set up with 4 school boards and the Deputy Minister of Education. And perhaps we could ask the Auditor General for his thoughts on this, but we could go ahead without the Department of Education, given the 4 school boards have agreed to attend. The meeting is on Chapter 2 of the Fall Auditor General Report on Regional School Board Governance and Oversight. So the main subjects for the meeting, I would expect, would be the school boards. But if we do go ahead with the meeting on May 11th, we would not have the Deputy of Education with us. Perhaps, if I may, Mr. Pickup, do you have any comments on that? Would that be critical that we have the Deputy of Education at that meeting? Mr. Pickup.
Respecting that this is just advice, of course, and it is your decision, I would suggest going ahead with the 3 chairs of the school boards. This was very much an audit of oversight and about how these school boards are doing. And then if something happens in that and they pass a lot of it on to the department, you could probably always have the option of bringing the deputy from the department in at a later date. But that would be my advice.
Thank you, Mr. Pickup. Does the committee have any thoughts? Is there agreement, Ms. Zann?
I think that's a great idea, too. I would agree with that.
Thank you. I'm seeing agreement on the committee, so our clerk will take note of that, and we will proceed with the meeting on the 11th. The other request for rescheduling of the meeting has come from Service Nova Scotia, and this is regarding the Registry of Infrastructure Renewal and Associated Costs. Now, this meeting was scheduled for May the 18th. We do have a vacancy on June 1st, which we could meet with them, and otherwise, they could agree to, if we don't have the auditor, or sorry, the deputy minister on May 18th, we could have another senior person in the department. So option A is we move the meeting to June 1st, or B, we go ahead with the meeting on May the 18th, but with somebody else in the department, senior. Any comments from members? I'm hearing June 1st. I'm seeing agreement. Our clerk will make note of that. So we have a decision on both of those meetings. Our next meeting is scheduled for next week, May the 4th. We will have the Department of Municipal Affairs to discuss Chapter 5 of the November 2015 Auditor General Report, and that is on monitoring and funding to municipalities. We will have a briefing for that meeting at 8:30 that morning, and we will have a briefing after that meeting at 11 o'clock for a meeting that we'll be having the following week. Is everybody okay with that? Mr. Pickup.
It's Department of Municipal Affairs, Monitoring and Funding. I think it's meant to say to municipalities, not universities.
Perhaps I read that wrong.
No, it says universities.
Okay. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. So everybody's clear. Because I'm still not, but everybody else is. That's all that matters. Mr. Houston.
Just seems like with the 2 briefings, one on each end of the meeting, that's a lot for me personally to absorb. I don't know if maybe we can we reschedule the after briefing?
If members wish, we could have the briefing for the meeting that'll be coming up on, the following week. We could do the briefing that morning at 8:30. Is there agreement at 8:30 that same week? Yes. Okay. Seeing agreement, our clerk will make note of that. So thank you, everyone. Unless there's any business to come before the committee, Mr. Houston, we have just a minute and a half left.
Yeah, and just maybe I'd like to get the Mr. Pickup's recommendation. We did write to the internal audit, and there was a couple letters circulated asking them to take more responsibility in getting recommendations implemented. They wrote back saying they thought it was just fine in the hands of the department. I don't know if you have any advice. Is there somebody else we should write to try and move that along, or?
Mr. Pickup.
I do have some advice on that, and I just reread the letter. My suggestion would be is to bring in the chair of the audit committee to talk about, could you at least receive some monitoring information as a way of a status update to where things are, and if you have some concerns, then you could bring the deputy in for the areas you might have concern. So you wouldn't be asking the chair of the audit committee to speak to why a particular department may have a low implementation, but he could bring you the tool to know that 6 months earlier by coming in and walking you through that initial sort of overview. That would be, I think, respecting sort of what they're saying, but serving your needs in terms of getting an early gauge of where things may be off.
Maybe the chair can work with Mr. Pickup to draft a letter for committee review.
Do we have agreement from the committee to extend the meeting just briefly past 12 noon? No. No, okay. Mr. Rankin, did you have a comment? Mr. Rankin?
I think we do have a subcommittee coming up within the next couple of weeks where we can discuss.
Order, the time for the meeting has expired. Just to close, the meeting is now adjourned. We'll pick up business in the next meeting if need be. Thank you.